Okay, so you want to own a medieval monastery. You're picturing men in robes, bread and water, silence, poverty. A handful of guys praying in a cold stone room, living on turnips. That's the deal, right? You take the vow, you get the misery, and in exchange you get to feel holy. You don't actually own it. Not really. Once land passed into a monastery's hands under English law, it became what lawyers called mortmain, the dead hand. That land could never be sold, never split among heirs, never seized the normal way, ever again. It belonged to the saint, forever. You're not the owner, your staff. And buried in the fine print, if the king decides one of his aging servants needs a place to retire, he can send that man to your door with a royal order, and you are legally required to feed him, house him, and care for him for the rest of his natural life. You didn't choose your new permanent guest. You can't evict him. Welcome to the business. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly how a supposedly poor institution became the largest landowner in most of medieval Europe, why a single hop garden's tax bill in the 8th century turned into a beer company still doing tens of millions of euros in revenue today, and how a shrine full of jewelry could account for a third of a cathedral's entire income. Until the day it didn't. Last, and this is the important one, why a monastery was never actually a monastery. It was a corporation with a chapel attached, and somewhere in the middle of this video, we're circling back to that house guest the crown can force on you, because that one clause has quietly ended abbots who never saw it coming. Let's talk tiers, because monastery covered everything from a leaky barn with 6 monks to an empire with its own foreign policy. Bottom tier, the small house. Under English law, by 1536, any monastery earning less than £200 a year in assessed income was legally classified as small and marked for closure first. That's not a rounding error. Across the roughly 650 to 800 religious houses assessed in the Valor Ecclesiasticus survey of 1535, the total annual take was only about £140,000. Which puts the average house well within spitting distance of that 200 pounds line. Most monasteries were small businesses. A dozen monks, a manor house's worth of land, a few tenant farms paying rent twice a year. Think of it as owning a small apartment building with an unusually devout set of tenants. Middle tier, somewhere like Furness Abbey in Cumbria. By the time of its dissolution, Furness was assessed at £805 a year, the wealthiest monastery in its region, and the second richest Cistercian abbey in all of England. Here you're not just collecting rent anymore, you're running actual industries. Sheep on the fells, cattle, lead mines, stone quarries, all reporting up through a grange system. Granges being the outlying farms run by lay brothers and hired labor on the abbey's behalf. Top tier, Cluny in Burgundy. At its peak, Cluny wasn't running one monastery. It was running roughly 1,000 of them, with something like 300 priories reporting directly up to the abbot, stretching from Poland to Scotland. Its church was, for 2 centuries, the largest building in Christendom, financed by kings. 4 Cluniac abbots went on to become pope. At this level, you're not managing a business. You're managing other people's businesses and taking a cut of everyone, plus an annual stipend the Pope himself paid straight into Cluny's coffers in the 11th century. Notice the pattern across all 3 tiers. Nobody here is buying in with a lump sum the way you'd buy a shop or a ship. Small houses grew from land donated by a founder hoping for prayers in return. Middle-tier houses like Furness grew industry by industry, one grange and one flock at a time, over generations. And an empire like Cluny grew by absorbing other, smaller Benedictine houses that voluntarily folded themselves into the network for the protection and prestige of the brand. The entry price for this business was never cash on the table. It was time, patience, and a reputation good enough that other people wanted to hand you their land. Nobody warns you about the hidden costs at any tier, though. Your library isn't a hobby. It's a farm liability. A single large Bible could swallow the skins of roughly 500 sheep or calves before a scribe even picked up a pen. Your buildings are worse. Rebuilding an abbey church in stone, the way Fountains and Cluny both did, meant decades of quarrying, transport, and skilled masons that had nothing to do with the actual business of running the abbey. A half finished church wasn't exactly a good look for an institution claiming divine favor, so it never stayed half finished for long, and neither did the bill. And then, there's the one we already teased, the corrody, a lifetime maintenance contract assigned by the crown that no landlord-tenant court on earth is going to help you break. Now the fact you'll actually repeat to someone. Archaeologists digging at Fountains Abbey recently found a massive tannery on site, meaning the monks weren't just farming 18,000 sheep for wool, they were turning the hides into the very parchment their own scribes wrote their own books on. The wool business and the publishing business were quite literally the same cow. So where does the money actually come from? Think of the tithe like a subscription you can never cancel. Every household and farm in a parish owed the local church roughly a tenth of what it produced: grain, wool, lambs, cheese, every year, forever, whether they liked the service or not. In 768, a hop garden near a small Bavarian monastery called Weihenstephan was recorded paying exactly this: 10% of its harvest handed to the monks up the hill. One garden, 1/10 of one harvest, a rounding error. Watch what happens when you multiply that rounding error by time. Weihenstephan turned the same hop tithe into an official brewing license by 1040 and never really stopped. Today, the brewery on that same hill, state-owned now, but sitting on 9 centuries of continuous operation, pulls in about 46.6 million euros a year. One tithed garden, compounded for 12 centuries, becomes a company selling beer across the world. Break the income into its real streams. Rents and tithes were the floor, steady, boring, the recurring base everything else got stacked on top of. Production was the multiplier. Fountains ran something like 18,000 sheep, Rievaulx close to 14,000, and Cistercian wool specifically earned a reputation for quality that let houses charge more per sack than an ordinary farmer down the road. Manuscripts were the luxury line. A commissioned 2-volume legal commentary from a 14th century French abbey cost 62 livres and 11 sous, months of a scribe's labor, billed like a custom software contract before you've even added the illuminator's fee. And pilgrimage was the wild card. At Canterbury in the 13th century, total cathedral income was £1,406, and offerings left at the shrines alone made up more than 30% of it. Nearly a third of your revenue from people paying to stand near a dead man's bones. Notice something about that list. 3 of those 4 streams, land, wool, pilgrimage, didn't need the monks to do very much at all. Tenants farmed the land, hired shepherds ran the flocks. Pilgrims showed up on their own initiative, drawn by a murder that happened a century earlier. The monks' actual job, in cash flow terms, sat closer to asset management than labor. That's not an insult. It's the reason this model outlasted plagues, wars, and bad harvests that wiped out ordinary farms in a single season. One-sentence formula for the whole business. Revenue equals land times scale times time. And almost everything this institution does stand, the tithes it defends in court, the flocks it expands, the relics it guards, exists to maximize that last factor. Because unlike literally every other medieval business, this one never dies, never divides an inheritance, and never has to sell. Compare that to the family running the mill down the road. Their income depends on one working wheel, one healthy heir, one good harvest in a row. Lose any of the 3 and the business is over within a generation. A monastery's land, by contrast, doesn't age, doesn't get sick, and doesn't need to be split 3 ways when the owner dies, because the owner, legally speaking, never dies. That single structural difference is why a modest tithe collected in 768 could still be compounding revenue 1,000 years later, while the mill down the road changed hands and probably changed families a dozen times over the same span. You've probably visited a cathedral and never once asked why the big attraction, the shrine, always sits behind the high altar, forcing you down a long side aisle first. That's not architecture for its own sake. That's a funnel. The 1428 customary for the Shrine of Thomas Becket at Canterbury reads almost like an operations manual. Clerks meeting tired pilgrims, seating them by the fire, serving bread and cheese and ale, then walking them through a full sequence. Mass at the site of the murder, Mass at the tomb, before they ever reached the shrine itself. Every stop was a chance to sell a lead badge, extend the visit, extract one more coin. A theme park queue with incense. Insider term for you, a corrody. It's the lifetime care contract we've been circling. The medieval version of buying an annuity, except instead of a monthly check, you get a room, meals, and staff until you die. Wealthy people without heirs or retired royal servants handed over cash or land up front for guaranteed care. And this wasn't fringe economics. Historians who've run the actual actuarial math on corrody pricing have found abbots weren't just handing these out of desperation. Priced correctly, accounting for the buyer's age and likely lifespan, a corrody could turn a real profit for the house selling it. The risk only showed up when a corrody wasn't sold, but assigned, by a crown that didn't have to price it fairly at all, Shres, because none of the money at risk was the crown's. The VIP segment here wasn't tourists. It was corrodians and crown favorites. Take John Amadas, a corrodian tied to Tavistock Abbey. The abbot granted him and his son an annuity of 40 shillings on top of his base corrody, just to keep him agreeable. When Tavistock was dissolved in 1539, Amadas didn't walk away empty-handed. He petitioned the crown for a pension to replace the corrody he'd lost, and got £5 plus back payments for his trouble. One man extracting value from this system on both sides of its collapse. So if the machine is this steady, land that can't be taken, income that renews every harvest, why did houses keep going broke? Everything else start with labor. After the Black Death tore through the workforce in the mid-14th century, houses like Fountains had to replace their free lay brother workforce with paid hired hands. And payroll doesn't care about your vow of poverty. Then taxation, coming from two directions at once. The crown wanted its cut, Rome wanted its cut. And neither cared whether the other had already been paid. Then the exotic one, building overruns. Cluny's third and final church became the largest in Christendom, financed by kings, and it demanded resources that were, by any honest accounting, out of proportion to what the abbey's actual rents could support. You can look cash flow positive on paper and still be structurally broke because of one architectural ego project. And here's the part that lands on you personally. Remember the corrody, the contract you can't refuse. If a healthy 40-year-old royal servant shows up at your gate with a crown letter, you now owe him food, lodging, and care for as long as he lives. Not a fixed term, not negotiable. You don't pick who they send you, and you cannot buy your way out once it's assigned. A small house on £200 a year can be handed a guest whose upkeep eats a real slice of that every year for decades with zero option to cancel. The land renews itself. The roof, the payroll, the guest list, none of them do. Two mistakes killed monasteries over and over across 4 centuries. Mistake 1. Betting too much of your income on something you don't control. The crowd's affection. At Canterbury, the Shrine of Thomas Becket generated more than 30% of total cathedral revenue for over 3 centuries after his murder in 1170. Then, in 1538, the crown destroyed the shrine outright. That income didn't shrink. It went to zero, overnight by royal decree, and there was no backup revenue stream sized to absorb the gap. When a third of your business depends on strangers wanting to stand next to one specific corpse, you don't run a business. You run a fad with very good architecture. Mistake 2. Leveraging a safe income stream to fund an unsafe ambition. Furness Abbey, the wealthiest house in its region, the second richest Cistercian abbey in England, mortgaged its own abbey, and lands as loan security back in 1276, borrowing against a future it assumed would keep paying out the way it always had. 2.5 centuries later, in 1537, it became the very first of England's greater monasteries dissolved, and its own commissioner's report pointed straight at its size and wealth as the reason. The monks didn't run. They negotiated, holding out for months and eventually securing a cash payout to leave quietly. But look at the sale itself. Almost £800 was grossed from stripping the abbey down to its stones. After costs, legal fees, the payout to send the monks on their way, only £367 was left for the crown to actually pocket. The wealthiest Cistercian house in the north of England sold off for roughly 46 cents on the dollar. Picture using an entire year's grocery budget as collateral for a marble staircase nobody asked for, betting the pantry restocks itself before the bill comes due. Being the richest house on the block was never as safe as it looked. Here's the group that's still standing 900 years later, and it isn't the one that scaled the hardest. Look at the Carthusians, at the Grande Chartreuse in the French Alps. They make one product, a green herbal liqueur dating to 1605, and global sales sit around $30 million a year. Not a rounding error, but nowhere near Clooney-scale empire money either. That gap is the whole strategy. The recipe has, by tradition, been known to only 2 or 3 living monks at any time. Something genuinely impossible to copy because there's nothing written down for a competitor to steal. They've never patented it, on purpose, since a patent expires and a well-kept secret doesn't. Better to trust silence than trust the law. So when demand spiked, they didn't chase it. In 2019, the monks deliberately capped production at 1.6 million bottles a year, which promptly triggered a real, headline-making shortage instead of a bigger factory. The boring parts get handed off entirely. A separate company, Chartreuse Diffusion, runs the packaging and sales, while the monks keep the one thing that actually matters. Every windfall gets treated as a subsidy for the mission, rather than fuel for expansion, funding a life of silence and solitude instead of a second production line. And when the French government expelled the order from the country in 1903, the monks simply carried the recipe to Spain and kept producing because the asset was never the building. It was always the 2 men who knew the formula. One monk with a recipe nobody else has is a job for life. 1,000 priories reporting up to 1 abbot is an empire waiting for a tax collector to notice it. This order chose to stay small enough to survive, which is exactly why it's still pouring liqueur while empires like Clooney are down to a gift shop and some ruins. So let's step back for a second. How can a business be, at the same time, one of the safest income streams in medieval Europe, and one of the most frequently bankrupted institutions of its age? Because those are 2 different parts of the same machine. Compare it to a simple medieval bakery. No legal immortality, no unkillable tithe right, no protection from the crown deciding to seize it on a whim. But also no 40-year forced house guest, no mortgage against a marble staircase, no unlimited liability hiding in the deed. A bakery's risk is small because its scale is small. A monastery's core income, the land, the tithe, the rent roll, is about as close to unlosable as medieval finance got. But precisely because that income was so steady, it kept attracting bigger promises stacked on top of it. Bigger churches, bigger staffs, bigger guest lists it couldn't say no to. The trade at the heart of this entire industry was always the same: rock-solid land, against everything standing on it. Some houses took that deal quietly for 900 years. Others bet the whole thing on a shrine, a mortgage, or a building project, and lost. Which brings us to the people who actually won. So, how much would you actually make if you did this right? Scenario 1. The modest path. You take over a small house, the kind assessed under that £200 a year threshold, a dozen monks and a handful of tenant farms. Your investment is basically zero, since the land was donated, not bought. Your income is small, but essentially locked in by tithe and rent harvest after harvest. Your payback period is instant because you never fronted any capital in the first place. It's boring. It survives plagues, wars, and bad harvests precisely because it never bet big on anything. No shrine to lose overnight, no marble staircase to mortgage the pantry for, no ambitious abbot betting the roof on a building project. The laundromat of medieval finance. Nobody's writing a video about you, and that's exactly why you're still standing in 1530 when the flashier houses down the road are already in trouble. Scenario 2, the top path. And here's the last turn of the knife. You take over something. Cluny scale. 1,000 priories, kings for patrons, popes for alumni. The investment isn't cash, it's decades. Of political favor trading, of rebuilding a broken balance sheet, of outlasting rivals, and the real payout at the top of this industry was never gold. It was control of the crown itself. Look at Abbot Suger of Saint Denis, born around 1081 to a family of no particular means, handed over to the abbey as a child oblate at roughly age 10, donated to the institution before he was old enough to have any say in it. He grew up alongside the future King Louis VI, a friendship that would shape his entire career, and by his late 20s, he was already representing the abbey's interests directly to the Pope. When he became abbot in 1122, he inherited a house that was financially shaky and had drifted into something closer to a royal party venue than a monastery. Courtiers and soldiers wandering the grounds, discipline gone slack. He fixed the money first. He reorganized the abbey's estates and replaced fixed rents with a share of the actual annual yield, so income rose and fell with real harvests instead of a number. Some predecessor had guessed wrong a generation earlier. Only then did he turn to the building, using the abbey's own profitable fare and that repaired rental income to fund a full rebuild of the church, pioneering pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and walls of stained glass in a style we now simply call Gothic, with materials recorded at over 42 marks of gold for the choir alone by 1144. Then, in 1147, King Louis VII left for the Second Crusade, and handed Suger the keys to the entire kingdom, naming him Regent of France. He ran the country for 2 years. When the king came home, he called Suger the father of his country. A peasant's son, given away as a child before he could object, dies in 1151, having quietly run France. That's the ceiling of this industry. It was never denominated in coins. So, do you still want to own a medieval monastery? Here's the actual deal on the table. A business that can never legally be sold, taxed away, or divided, that mints income out of the ground itself, forever. Whose single biggest risk is a stranger the king can move into your spare room for as long as that stranger happens to live. Vow of poverty. Sure, just remember the name on the deed. It was never yours to begin with.